Hello everybody, welcome back to International Trade. This is our last lecture. Uh, let's finish with a bang. Last time we studied the effects of tariffs. We saw that when a country imposes a tariff, it can cause several things. First, it causes a deadweight loss. Second, if it's a large economy, it can influence the terms of trade by reducing the world price of a good. And third, there is an effect on firms' profits. Last time we ignored that because we focused on perfect competition and we looked at the case of a small economy and of a large economy. We saw that the small economy has no advantage in setting a tariff because the welfare gains from the tariff are negative. On the other hand, a large economy can impose an optimal tariff, which is positive, and that can improve welfare. So I really hope that by ending the lecture there, you started wondering whether Donald Trump was right or not imposing those tariffs on China. You may think, okay, well, the US is a large economy by all standards, right? So if the US imposes a tariff, if they're smart enough to impose it in the industries with low export supply elasticity, and they're smart enough to find the optimal tariff, well, then perhaps imposing the tariff was a good idea, wasn't it? Well, the issue is that obviously China retaliated. And so imagine that China, imagine that an identical situation to what we saw last time also occurs with China. In other words, the US is importing a good from China. They impose an optimal tariff, they create a welfare gain. If we look back at the picture, the welfare gain was E minus B plus D. So what if there is also another good, let's say that it's an identical good volume-wise that is imported from the US to China. China imposes an optimal tariff and everything is identical, so the welfare gains for China are E minus B plus D. So what basically happens is that the two E, right, cancel out worldwide, meaning that China loses E because the US is imposing the optimal tariff, but it regains it by imposing an optimal tariff on the US. However, imposing tariffs is not a zero-sum game. It causes deadweight losses, causes inefficiency in the market. And so if both countries impose the optimal tariff, we end up in a situation where the deadweight loss are there, and so welfare is lower relative to the case in which none of the countries imposes tariffs. So what is this? Yes, this is the prisoner's dilemma. If the two countries do not impose tariff, they gain the highest welfare. If one country deviates and imposes a tariff, its welfare improves at the expenses of the other country. If the other country retaliates and also imposes a tariff, the two countries end up being in a situation worse than the beginning. So this is a problem, right? So how can we make sure that this doesn't happen? Well, we're going to use the tools of game theory that you studied in the first part of this course. First, we're going to make an institution. We're going to call it GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. This was established in 1947, after World War II. I think that after World War II, there were basically three institutions, international institutions that were created to sort of prevent the economic causes of World War II. And these were the IMF, which was the International Monetary Fund, supposedly to basically be a lender of last resorts for countries in case they had, some fiscal troubles. And there was the World Bank, which had the objective of being a bank for the reconstruction of the European countries destroyed by World War II. And then the countries, we didn't talk about it when we studied the history of globalization, But right after the Great Depression of 29, the US decided to follow the same strategy that Trump followed and imposed tariffs on imports from abroad with the hope of raising local employment. And of course, the other countries of the world retaliated, and so that's one of the reasons why between World War I and World War II, there wasn't much globalization going on. So a lot of people thought that this return to protectionism after the Great Depression was not a good idea, was instrumental in what happened afterwards and in prolonging the depression. And so they wanted to avoid that to ever happen again, and they created the GATT. So look at this. According to this institution, countries met periodically to negotiate for lower tariffs. So we said that when countries are large, they have a positive optimal tariff, but when they play a game with another country, well, there is a prisoner's dilemma going on. And so what is a way to solve the prisoner's dilemma? Is to repeat the game several times. So what you do is you have countries meet periodically to negotiate for lower tariffs. So that if you and I today decide to lower the tariffs, and then you don't do that, or you increase your tariff, next time we meet, I know that you're not reliable, I know that there's no talking with you, and so we're just gonna keep having the tariffs high between us, okay? Then in 94, 95, the WTO was established as a proper institution, okay? And there's been some rules that have been added by the WTO, and so let's look at the main ones. The first one is the most favored nation one. The idea here is that you cannot discriminate among the WTO members. I mean, there are exceptions, but we're going to talk about that in a second. In other words, if you impose a tariff on Chinese good, you have to impose the same tariff for all the other countries. Okay? And so basically what this is happening is that typically country has a most favored nation. So say Denmark has low tariffs with Sweden, but high tariff with say New Zealand. When Denmark enters the WTO and Sweden and New Zealand are both in the WTO, what Denmark has to do is apply the tariff it applies to Swedish goods on everybody else in the WTO. And so what this rule generates is a force that reduces tariffs almost automatically. And so this is a great tool to reduce tariffs among countries. Now, obviously there are some exceptions to this. You can impose tariffs if there are some unfair trade practices, such as dumping. Or if you believe that, I don't know, a country, say the United States, imposed some tariffs with no proper legal grounds, you can retaliate and impose tariffs. Now, countries should not limit the quantity of goods and services they import. In other words, they should not have quotas, which we're going to study very briefly in a little while. And then there is this countries don't really like these export subsidies, because it looks like it's an unfair, it's an unfair competitive move from the foreign governments. Like, you have, I don't know, Vestas is competing with Siemens. Then you discover that Germany is giving Siemens, subsidies. So that means that there is an unfair competition between Vestas and Siemens. That would mean that the Danish government would like to intervene and help Vestas as well, maybe. You want to avoid that. If, there's a whole discussion between Boeing and Airbus, which I think in recent months has been resolved finally, exactly about this topic. And again, finally, countries can temporarily raise tariffs for certain product. Now, an important exception to the most favored nation rule is that countries within the WTO can create regional trade agreements. such as the European Union, for instance. So the fact that there are no tariffs between Denmark and Germany does not mean that Denmark needs to apply zero tariff to everybody else, okay? Because the European Union is a regional trade agreement, which is allowed under the WTO rules. What can we say about the tariff wars between the US and China? Well, there is an article on Vox in your reading list by Daniel Gross. And I really like this article because it's something that you could have also written. Because as you can see from the title, it says lessons from first principles of classic trade policy welfare analysis. So what it did was basically saying, okay, let's apply what we teach to our students in the analysis of the tariff wars by Trump. So if you're wondering how should we answer to the question, if say that question would arise in an exam, well, this article is the best way of answering it. Because as you can see, it lays down very nicely the arguments that we just made the previous lecture. And so we know that with a small tariff, the US perhaps might be better off. Obviously, that is dependent on whether the tariff has the right value, is on the right sectors. There's been a lot of controversies about the sectors in which Trump applied tariffs because oftentimes there were intermediate inputs like aluminum and steel, and that was problematic because yes, you were protecting the domestic production of aluminum and steel, but you were making all the companies that make products with aluminum and steel less competitive. Now, obviously, the small tariff would affect China negatively. If the U.S. government imposes a high tariff, obviously everybody is worse off in the trade. And if there's retaliation and everything else we discussed, there's a drop in bilateral trade that obviously has very negative welfare consequences. In principle, the rest of the world might be better off because the US and Chinese economies would substitute away from the Chinese and the US goods. So if the US can no longer import from China, perhaps it imports from Mexico or from other Southeast Asian countries such as Vietnam. Same thing for China. Okay. But there's something else that these tariffs have caused. And that something else is covered in this New York Times article. So I put this New York Times article in the reading list because this was the best description of a paper by Flynn, Ortaxu, and Tintelnot. And this is a very cool paper because what they do is basically look at the precise data on imports of washing machines, because these were the goods in which Donald Trump imposed tariffs at the very beginning of this trade with this tariff war. And so what we have in this figure here we have the monthly US imports of washing machines by different origins. Notice here that we have Mexico and Korea in green and light blue. And you see that sometime in 2012, the level of imports dropped to lower values. And that's because the US imposed anti-dumping duties on Mexican and Korean washing machines in 2012. Then we have China in this red color. You see that, in a way you can think that perhaps the reduction of imports from Mexico and Korea perhaps caused some substitution, right? But in any case, you have this rise in imports of washing machines from China. And then there's a tariff imposed on them in 2016, which reduces these imports to relatively low levels. And then you see now we substitute away from China, we buy from Vietnam and Thailand, and maybe other countries. And then there's other tariffs imposed in 2018, and that causes an widespread reduction of imports again. So this is basically causing production to shift to the US. You impose tariffs on washing machines, you import less, you're very likely to produce more. What happens to prices? Well, prices went up, just like our little model before would predict. Here we have in red that there is, this is sort of basically an event study, that's how it's portrayed here. You basically look at when the tariffs have imposed and you see what happened to the prices before and after. Here you have a number of controls and you're basically using a lot of fixed effects to do this. But basically what you see here is that the price of washers increased, okay? But there's also a price of something else that increased as well. And that is the price of dryers, which were not subjected to the tariff. So Donald Trump imposed tariffs on washing machines. And what happened is that the price of washing machines went up, as it's expected, but also the price of dryers went up, despite despite dryers not being subjected to the tariff. And in particular, the tariff was of about 20%, 25%. And what you see is basically the increase in price has been split between the washers and the dryers. They both increased by about 10%. And so basically what this little example is showing you is that, the profit part of our welfare analysis that we sort of disregarded with the perfect competition assumption could actually be fairly important and also detrimental to consumers. Because what you see basically here happening is the market power effects. Okay, now the price of washers increases, while people usually buy washers and dryers together. Why not increasing the price of dryers as well? Okay. So let's do some accounting now. What happened to welfare? Well, we have a tariff revenue of about $82 million. We have an increase in prices based, the consumer surplus, if you like, of $1.5 billion. And there's 1,800 jobs that were created. Okay, so basically, the article compares, but this is a very expensive way of creating jobs. Okay. Now you can actually get a lot of distance with our simple diagrams of demand and supply. Here's a little example that I wanted to show you because perhaps it's the best way to think about the infamous registration tax that we have in Denmark on cars. Basically think that scenario is best modeled as Denmark being even a small economy that is dealing with a foreign monopoly. Okay, Denmark does not have a car producer, right? And so it's basically dealing with foreign, companies, and let's just model that as a foreign monopoly. And so basically the foreign monopoly is facing a demand curve D, obviously has a marginal revenue curve MR in blue, lower than the demand. You have a marginal cost, so without a tariff, without any registration tax, you have here a supply, an export supply X1, which also equals the domestic consumption, right? And the price is P1. When the Danish government imposes the tariff, what happens is that the marginal cost curve shifts upward. Then there's going to be a new equilibrium and a new price. However, you can see basically graphically that the increase in price is smaller than the increase in the tariff, and then the increase in the marginal cost. And so basically what you have is a loss in consumer surplus, people that have to pay this tax to buy the car, and so the cars are the most expensive in Europe. And this is a fall of consumer surplus of C and D. And then there is actually the gains revenue-wise are C plus E, just like we had for the large economy. And this is because when you are facing a foreign monopoly, what you do is, well, if you impose a tariff on it, the foreign monopoly is going to absorb part of that tariff in its costs. It's not going to increase the prices to the extent of the tariff increase because there is an an incomplete pass-through of costs to prices. And so basically what you have is that the change in welfare is E minus D. And if you choose the tariff carefully, that could be positive. So this is a great way to think about the Danish government with the registration tax, and you see that that can actually improve welfare. And obviously that is legal because it's not a tariff. It's a tax. Any company that sells cars in Denmark has to pay, any transaction of cars in Denmark have to be subjected to this tariff. But basically, if you ever buy a car, you're going to see that the pre-tax price of the car is much, much lower than the pre-tax price that you would pay everywhere else in Europe, for instance. And now let's move to the study of quotas. A quota is a maximum number of units of a good that you're allowed to import in a country. Now we're going to show here that basically with perfect competition, tariffs and quotas are the same thing. So let's look, for instance, at a small economy. What you have here is, the supply curve in autarky, the demand curve in autarky. Here we have our world market with our import demand curve, capital M, and our export supply X. If the government imposes a quota X bar, it's basically limiting the total number of units of output that exporters can sell to the domestic economy, to say M1. And as a result, what happens is that the price in the domestic economy increases, so consumer surplus decline, producer surplus increases. And so you basically see in this picture that basically the quota and the tariff has a very similar effect. But the difference is the area C. If you look at the large economy, same thing. It basically what you can conclude here is that there is a tariff that generates the same level of imports, which is equivalent to this quota. Okay, so basically there is an equivalence with perfect competition between quotas and tariffs. However, as I said, there could be a potential difference in the area C. Why is that? Well, C is what we call the quadrants. What are quadrants? Well, if there is a quota, whoever is allowed to import the good, it basically has the possibility of selling the good at a higher price than the world price, because domestic consumer cannot just simply go abroad and buy the good because there is a quota. And so basically, whoever is allowed to import the good and sell it domestically is benefiting from the fact that there is a restricted supply imposed by the government. So these quadrants are very, very important because that is the equivalent of the government revenues with the tariffs. But the issue is who gets these quadrants? Well, first option is you give them to the home firms. Okay, so I don't know, we're talking about cars, you give it to the domestic car companies or car dealers. In the case the domestic firms get the C. Now, unfortunately, these quadrants, they allow you to make a profits with really no risk, right? And so what basically going to happen is that if you just give these quadrant licenses to domestic firms, what happens is that some people are going to try to get these licenses in legal ways or otherwise. In other words, they are going to spend some resources, time, money for bribery to obtain these licenses for themselves. And basically what we're going to think is that these activities are wasteful. And so what basically means is that some of that C, if not all of it, is going to be wasted. So that is not a good outcome. A possibly good outcome for the government, at least, is to action these quotas. If you set up an auction, basically this is the typical market equation, market situation, right? If you have an auction for something whose value is the quadrant, how much is the auction gonna determine the price to be equal to? Well, the price of the license is gonna exactly be equal to the quadrant. In other words, if by importing a car, you make a rent of 1,000 kroners, you're gonna be willing to pay 1,000 kroners for the quarter rent. And so basically what happens, one bids for 800, another one outbids the guy for 900, and this auction keeps going until the price gets equal to the quarter rent. And in the case, it's the government that cashes in these quarter rents. The last option is the most interesting one, and it's what the Japanese car companies did in the 70s and 80s when the US wanted to impose a tariff or a quota on the imports of Japanese cars, such as Nissan, Toyota. They were very rapidly gaining market share in the US at the expenses of the US companies. And so what the Japanese companies did was voluntarily put a quota on their exports. Basically, they have decided to reduce the number of cars that they would export, and as a result, they would at least take these quota rents for them. I like to close this course with this little topic on quality and multi-product firms. Just to give you a hint of how wide the world of international trade really is, and there's a lot of cool things that we can study, research on, and think about. And so this, I thought, is a great way to finish this course. And so let's look into this. So we're going to have a, sort of a simple model here. We're mainly going to focus on the problem of a firm and thinking that, there's some N varieties available for consumption, just like in the Krugman model. And these varieties are going to differ in terms of their quality. What does that mean in practice? Well, that means, we're going to define quality as, given the same price, you're going to demand more units of the higher quality good, right? So basically, quality is just a demand shift. We're also going to think that each firm is multi-product, meaning each firm produces M varieties. And so each firm, what needs to choose is the price of each variety and the quality for each variety. A firm is producing M products, perhaps also has to choose the number of products, but that would be for a different course. And then he has to choose the price and the quality for each variety. And obviously this has to be done across all destinations. So let's see how we can actually do that. So we're going to think that consumers have a CES utility function. This is the classical one that we've seen so many times in this course. It's our old friend. But you can see here that now the quantity consumed CI of a good is multiplied by a shifter Z, which is going to be our quality for product I. So if Z is higher, that means that basically, if you consume 1 unit of one good and 1 unit of another good, the utility and the first good is of higher quality, well, you get a higher utility from that consumption than from the consumption of 1 unit of a low quality good. So if we solve this problem, we get the typical demand function, right? The C as a function of the price. But what you see in the textbook is actually there's a little trick. We're going to think about quality adjusted prices and quality adjusted quantities, meaning when I think that there is a quality adjusted price Q, which is the price P divided by the quality Z. And then we have a quality adjusted quantity, which is basically this term here. So Z times C. This is a little trick that basically makes the algebra way simpler. So basically the consumer problem is to maximize the utility subject to the budget constraint. So you see here the Lagrangian is the maximization. The objective function is our utility. And then we have our budget constraint. If we apply this little trick, what do we get? Well, we get a slightly simpler formula. We have the summation of the I to the power of sigma minus 1 over sigma instead of Zi Ci. And then we have sort of a similarly complex budget constraint. What's nice here is that we basically have this demand, which is a typical CES demand. So that the demand is a function of the quality adjusted price Qi to the power of minus sigma. And then we have the price index is the summation. It's basically an average of the quality adjusted prices. So recall that the price index is the level of expenditures you need to get one unit of utility. And so if you have the price index is a function of the prices and the quality, it's basically saying that if the quality increases, everything else constant, your utility will go up. The amount of money that you need to pay to get one unit of utility will decline. So this is how we can think of quality in these models. What about firms? Well, we're gonna think here that consumers pay a price PI, which is a price P star plus a specific trade cost, capital T of I. There's gonna be, if you want to produce at a certain level of quality, you have to pay for it. So basically, the unit cost associated with producing one unit of output are a function of the quality. So that basically, if you have a good that has a high quality, that would also have higher marginal costs. And so we're gonna think that the marginal costs are sort of Malik's looking marginal cost, where the wage divided by the productivity of the firm phi times the quality to the power of 1 over theta. Okay, so if theta goes to infinity, z is absent there. And so you can see that basically theta is capturing the elasticity of unit costs with respect to quality. How expensive it is to increase your quality. So what are the profits of the firm? Well, the firm gets the price P star. Okay. So imagine this. Imagine that a firm is setting a price, right? Then there are the shipment costs. Shipping costs are the specific trade cost, capital T of I. Okay, and basically what happens is that the consumer price is the summation of the price that the firm receives plus this specific trade cost, capital T. So that is therefore the profit margin of the firm is P star minus G, the unit cost, multiplied by the quantity. And then if you substitute this function here, we get the price the consumer pays minus the specific cost minus the unit cost, that is your profit margin. So if we apply our little trick that I showed you before of substituting the price for the quality adjusted price and the demand for the quality adjusted demand, what you get is this function. Okay? But so what we have here is that the firm needs to choose the quantity Qi, the quality adjusted price Qi, and the quality level Z. And where is Z here? Well, Z only appears in this term. That's why we're doing this. That's why we're applying the little trick to simplify our life. Basically, to choose quality, a firm needs to minimize that term there. Okay? The higher this term, the lower the profit, because there's a negative term in front of it. And so we want to make this term as little as possible. This term is basically a quality adjusted unit cost. And so to minimize that, we take a derivative. I'm showing you all the steps here. We don't have to do algebra in the very last part of this course. But basically what you get is this expression where you have that the quality is a function of your productivity, the wage, and the parameter theta. And it's also a function of TI. So let's take the logs of that. So the log of the quality is a function of the productivity. Makes sense, right? More productive firms, worry less about the fact that higher quality increases the costs because they have higher productivity, and so they will sell higher quality goods. But then you see here something strange, right? What you see here is that the level of quality increases with the specific trade costs. Huh. That's surprising, isn't it? This is something that we call the Washington apples effect. Basically, Washington apples are of high quality, and the anecdote goes that only these Washington apples of high quality would be sold a very large distance. So in the state of New York, which is the opposite way of the US relative to the state of Washington, Washington is where Seattle is. Basically, only the highest quality apples from the Washington state would be found in the New York state. We could also do a similar example for Denmark, okay? Perhaps we could call this the Trentino apples effect. In the Bilka I go to, the only apples that I find that come from abroad are the ones from Italy, in particular from northern Italy, and in particular from Trentino Alto Adige, in particular the Südtirol, so the part close to Austria, and these are renowned for being high quality, and that's what you find in Denmark. Okay, so this is very interesting. This is saying that if the specific trade costs increase, your quality will increase. So why is that? Well, let's, exit a little bit this model and think in terms of a price of a high quality good H and a low quality good L. So the price PH over PL is basically a function of the price that the firms receive, P star H, plus this specific trade cost T. So this ratio is actually decreasing in capital T, right? If capital T is 0, the ratio, is some number greater than 1, presumably, since the higher quality good is more expensive to produce. And as, if this T goes to infinity, this ratio goes to 1. So basically what's happening here is that if the specific trade cost increase, well, this means that the relative price of high quality goods versus low quality goods decline. High quality goods are relatively cheaper. Okay? And so that's why you sell more high quality goods at more distant destinations, because it's relatively cheaper to sell those goods there. Another way to think about it is, okay, suppose that you want to sell, apples from northern Italy to Denmark. The shipping cost is 50 euros per kilo. You're gonna pay that 50 euros regardless of whether you sell low quality apples or high quality apples. But you understand here that basically if the costs associated with shipping are the same, well, that means that it's much more convenient to export a higher quality good, because it's as if you're spreading this specific cost over higher prices. And so the specific cost becomes less important. So this is a very interesting and simple result that you can get when you start getting a little more exploratory with these models, and you look at qualities and how it interacts with the trade costs. But now let's look at the presence of multi-product firms, because that also generates new results that we haven't seen in this class. We said before that these multi-product firms have to choose the quality and the prices. The quality we've chosen. What about the price? Well, let's write out fully the profit equation of the firm. This is what we wrote before. Here we have the profit margin times the quantity D. If we substitute quantity D with the formula that I showed you before, this formula here, what you get is this effect. Okay, so what you get here is that, we substitute D and we get this function of the quality adjusted prices. So what's happening here? Well, when a firm is multi-product, a firm has to choose the prices of all its goods. If it increases the price of one good, what's going to happen? Well, the demand for that good will decline, but the demand for all the other goods that the company sells will actually increase. Vice versa, if the company reduces the price of one variety, the demand for that variety will increase, but that's going to cannibalize the sales on the other varieties of the firm. So to see this, basically this is the first order condition of the firm problem. The first one is the standard FOC for a problem with CES preferences, right? If we didn't have the other term, you see here that we would cancel out the stuff with the C, with the sigma. This term would also cancel out. And then we have, sigma minus 1. Perhaps you can already see that what you would get would be like the standard constant markup over unit cost. But now there's an extra term, and that is the cannibalization effect. And that is the effect that if you increase the price of one good, you actually increase the demand for all the other products that you sell. And as a result, you're going to charge higher markups. If you go through with the algebra, which is always a good fun exercise, what you basically find is that the company is going to charge a constant markup over the varieties that it produces. And this markup is a function of the firm market share S. And in particular, the larger the market share, the larger the markups. And that's because if you increase the price of one good, that's gonna basically increase the demand. So if you increase the price of one good, that is going to increase the demand for all the varieties in the market. That matters to you to the extent that that increases your own varieties. And so the larger you are in the market, the larger this effect affects your varieties. And so the larger you are in the market, the larger your markups and prices are going to be. So that's it for the course. I will talk about the exam, and actually we have been talking about the exam in the Wednesday sections, so I'm not going to talk about it in this video recording. Recall that if you have any questions, you can always send me an email. This has been very fun. It's been actually felt very privileged to be able to record these videos and put them online and trying to do the best with this Corona situation. I know that this is not ideal. I tried my best to make these lectures as lively as possible. Hopefully you find them exciting enough to follow them. So good luck with the continuation of your scholastic career and forward. And so I'll see you when I see you. Ciao.